I'd like to preface this story by being clear that I do not subscribe to any steadfast belief in ghosts or the paranormal. Aside from this story, there is very little evidence to prove or dismiss any facts herein. What I saw and the events that followed are still hard to explain. All I can be certain of is that I was there and I experienced these events firsthand. It was late February and still very cold in southwestern Ohio. My mother had been trying for weeks to get me to come over for dinner, and one evening I finally found the time to take her up on the offer. I had my dog along with me for the trip. He was an old German short-hair pointer and couldn't have been happier to join along for the ride. He hopped in the back seat of my SUV and we made our way down the long stretches of rural roads that cut through acres of cornfields and rolling hills that our part of the Midwest was known for. We arrived shortly before sunset and Mom already had dinner waiting on the table. We talked and ate while the dog sat waiting patiently for the table treats that my mother had made him accustomed to. About an hour had passed and I could see the dog was starting to get restless, so I decided to take him for a walk. I grabbed my coat and hat, clipped a leash on his collar, and we made our way out the door. It was dusk when we set out on our walk. There were only a few thin orange stretches of light remaining in the skyline from the sunset. They were barely visible through the gray winter clouds. The crunching sounds from our footsteps in the snow echoed off the trees and the neighboring houses as we made our way towards the small subdivision that was adjacent to our home. I grew up in this neighborhood and I took mental notes on the changes that had been made to the surrounding homes since I'd last seen them. There were some that had new siding or a fresh coat of paint. A few had recently blacktopped a driveway. One house had a new pool. I remember thinking to myself that things were looking pretty good in the old neighborhood. We continued walking up the hill when a house off in the distance came into view. It was a dingy white two-story home that sat on the corner of the only intersection in the subdivision. The grass on the lot was overgrown and peeking up through the snow, and the yard was littered with random things. There was an old bike, a wheelbarrow, a collection of frozen newspapers lying in the U-shaped gravel driveway, a wobbly-looking shed, an abandoned garden, and other random garbage strewn about the property. I wasn't sure if someone was living there at the time or if the house had been foreclosed on and abandoned. I remember the children who used to live there years ago that rode the school bus with me. I remembered stopping there for trick-or-treat. I even remembered the Christmas lights the previous owners had put up when I was young. In the middle of my reminiscing, something caught my eye. There was a dark object on the home that seemed to sit between the second-story window and a small section of awning that covered the front entrance. I was about 20 yards from the home and approaching the east side when I first noticed it. Even though I was able to identify other items in the yard that were the same distance away, for some reason it was hard to make out what this particular object was. My first reasonable guess, judging by the size and location, was that it was a window AC unit that had been covered up with a dark tarp. I figured maybe someone didn't want to bother lugging it off the roof and just put a tarp over it to protect it from the snow and rain while it wasn't needed during the winter months. It seemed like the same kind of lazy thing that a person who doesn't bother cutting their grass or picking up the trash around their home would do, and I was content with that guess. But the closer I got towards the home, the less that theory seemed to make sense. We continued our approach and I held my gaze on the object. I was maybe 10 yards away and my guess was losing credibility with each step. Whatever this was, it didn't seem to have the edges you would expect for a window unit. It really didn't seem to have any edges at all. I tried to think up other things it could possibly be, but nothing seemed to make any sense. It was just a misshapen dark object. It started to really bother me that I couldn't get a good look at this thing. I was close enough to the home that I could see the paint chips flaking off the wood siding, and yet my eyes couldn't seem to focus on what this was. It was as if it were some kind of three-dimensional shadow. By then it was twilight and there were no other light sources aside from a few small patio lights on the neighboring homes. Far too small to create a shadow that large, and even if the lights were bigger and more powerful, there weren't any trees or obstructions to cast such a shadow so far up onto the home. Not long after I started thinking along the lines of this possibly being a shadow, the object began to do something very peculiar. It began to move. The first sign of movement was very subtle, so much so that I even took a few steps back to make sure my line of sight wasn't playing tricks on me. It wasn't. It was very clear that this object had begun to close the gap on the section of roof between itself and the window. It was definitely moving. I started to walk faster and with intent. I was determined to find out what this was. A cold chill ran down my spine as the object's speed of movement began to match my pace. The black mass passed over the gray shingles on the awning and blocked out the window ledge. I continued forward, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. It has to be a shadow, I thought. But why couldn't I see through it? Why was this the only dark spot on the home? What was the source of this shadow? The dog and I were about 5 yards away from the home when I first had the idea of stopping. If this were a shadow, then it would make sense that the object would seem to be moving as my position changed. We came to a stop, and for a second it made no further movement. I was just about to breathe a sigh of relief and chalk up the oddity to a simple misunderstanding of light and geometry when something unexplainable happened. The dark object continued across the remaining section of roofing and seemed to go through the window. All of my rationalizations crumbled and I stood there in disbelief. It wasn't long before the dog insisted on continuing our walk by pulling the slack out of the leash and lunging me forward. Reluctantly, I obliged, and we slowly made our way onward until eventually we were directly in front of the home. There was a part of me that didn't want to stop, but I succumbed to the temptation and once again brought the dog and myself to a halt. I raised my head towards the window area where I first noticed the object. There was no longer anything visible in the section of awning where I had originally seen it. Each shingle was clearly visible, even in the early night sky. I raised my eyes a bit further and focused my gaze on the window when a large dark object came into view. It was upright and towering within the frame on the opposite side of the glass. The reflection on the window pane from the porch light on the house across the street gave away the object's position. Although it took up most of the window, there were still a few inches visible above it and on the sides to see into the other areas of the room behind it. Maybe it was all in my head, but I had the feeling it was staring back at me. There was still no way I could positively ID it. There was nothing else I could do but keep walking. It wasn't as if I was going to kick in the door to the house and tell whoever may have been living there to get out. What would I even say to them if I did? That I saw a weird shadow in the window? No. The dog and I did what we set out to do and continued our walk. We rounded the intersection and circled the cul-de-sac at the end of the next street and again made our way back in front of the dingy white two-story. This time when I looked through the window, nothing was there. I could plainly see the features in the room through the clear window, the most visible of which was the other window on the opposite side of the room that looked out over the backyard. It was something that had been entirely blocked out by the shadowy mass that had stood there just minutes before. Even though it was much darker, I could clearly see the details of the room. You would think that not seeing something would help set my mind at ease, but it didn't. I paused briefly in a familiar disbelief, but the dog pulled me onward. It was time to go. Night had fallen, and the temperature had dropped a few more degrees. We finished our walk and were back safely inside my mother's home. We said our goodbyes promptly after our return. It was getting late, and I needed to process what I had witnessed. I was more than a little preoccupied in thought while I was loading the dog into my SUV. He assumed his usual spot opposite me in the back seat, and I made sure I closed the door all the way. It was an older Jeep, and things like the door hinges had some slop in them, so it took a good amount of force to get them closed. Once we were in, I started the engine, and we made our way down the driveway and onto the old state route. What did I really see? I kept thinking to myself. How did it get through the window? Where did it go? A truck was approaching off in the distance in the oncoming lane. As it got closer, I noticed it was a dually truck with a set of double tires in the rear. Nothing seemed to be a concern. They were in their lane and I was in mine, but at the moment our cars passed one another, there was a loud crash and then a thud in the back seat. The rear passenger side tire began shaking, and it was hard to keep the vehicle in my lane. It was as if the power steering had gone out and the tire had gone flat. It all happened so fast and was so loud that it took me a minute before I heard the dog whimpering in the back seat. It was a sort of tone that was obvious that he was in a lot of pain. Frantic, I found the first driveway I could pull into and immediately turned around to assess his condition. He was lying sideways on the floorboard and I couldn't see his face. I quickly got out and opened the door to him behind me. There was no blood, but he was shaking and seemed to be in shock. I slowly lifted his legs to make sure there were no broken bones and that he didn't yelp when I moved them. One side of his face seemed to be starting to swell, which indicated to me that that's where he took the impact. But what caused it? It took me a minute to notice that his collar was snapped off. The leash was still attached. My mind raced for explanations. Could his leash have been outside the car and snagged the passing truck? I wondered. I had to do that math. His leash was maybe 4 feet long, 5 tops. He was sitting on the passenger side of the back seat and the truck passed on the driver's side. Even if I had absent-mindedly closed it in the door, it would have been on the passenger side of the car and wouldn't have been long enough to catch the passing truck. Maybe the leash could have got caught in the passenger tire and it was just coincidence it happened as the other truck passed, I thought. Then the most obvious piece of evidence caught my attention that debunked the whole caught or snag theory. The leash was still sitting in the car. All 4 or 5 feet of it. This evening was going off the rails. After I made sure the dog was stable and didn't need immediate aid, I started my inspection of the Jeep. I checked the rear driver's side tire because it was closest to me. Nothing seemed out of place. I went around to the rear passenger tire expecting to see a flat. There was nothing visibly wrong. Surely something must be wrong with the rotor or maybe the axle. Still, there was nothing. I popped the hood to check the belts and fluid levels. Nothing was out of place or appeared to be low. I remembered saying out loud, "What the fuck is going on?" None of it made any sense. I went back around to check again on the dog. He had calmed down some but was still visibly shaken. I just stood there and shook my head wondering if I needed to call a tow truck. I decided to give the Jeep a short test run before I called it in. Besides, I couldn't see any reason why it couldn't get us home. I comforted the dog one last time before I tried the engine. It started up just fine. I turned the wheel right and left. Power steering seemed to be working fine. I put it in reverse and backed slowly towards the road. No shakes. No indication of tire problems. Once on the road, I put it in first gear and slowly accelerated, expecting the problems to reappear. Nothing. It drove as good as it ever did. Just minutes before, I was convinced that the car was unfit to drive and needed to be towed, and now it seemed like nothing had even happened. I was in total disbelief. We finished the rest of our trip back without issue. Not even a hint that something had been wrong aside from my poor dog's swollen face and a broken collar. Once home, I told my wife that he fell in the car, but I didn't go into detail how. I really didn't want to talk about it. I kept trying to think of rational ways to explain the things that happened that night and what I witnessed. Still, nothing seemed to make any sense, and all my theories had huge holes in them. In the days and weeks after, I began searching keywords online from what I had witnessed. Thinking rationally had provided me no answers on this particular event, and I couldn't just put it off to be forgotten. Shadow people came up quickly in the search query suggestions. Apparently they are an ancient phenomenon with all the written history and folklore you'd expect from something that had been documented for that long. The most reputable source I could find on this subject was a Dr. Morgan Spence. She was a guest on Coast to Coast AM in February of 2013. She discussed the topic in detail and suggested that there are real possibilities for the existence of shadow people, and she has spent the last 14 years studying the phenomenon. All the reports were consistent with what I saw. A dark 3D blob that can change shapes and sizes with enough form to block out what is behind them. May disappear or try to hide if noticed. I read all kinds of literature on the topic, too much if I'm being honest. There are many who insist that they are ominous beings that foreshadow, no pun intended, misfortunes and tragedies. I really wanted these events to make sense, but I'm still not really sure what happened that night. Did I witness one of the ancient shadow figures that have been reported on for centuries? Did it signal or perhaps even cause the injury to my dog and the brief mechanical failures on my Jeep? I don't know. All I know is that I did see something that night. Something did pull so hard on the dog's leash that it broke and he hit the floor. My Jeep did unexplainably begin to shake as if the back tire blew and the steering went out before it just as quickly went back to normal. The only thing I'm really certain of about that night is that it changed my perspective. It was the first time as an adult that I had a reason to question my reality as I knew it. It opened my mind to the haunting possibility that all these reports that seemed to correspond with mine weren't just coincidence, but instead factual accounts of a real thing other people have seen. I stress that I'm open to the possibility of these phenomenons being factual accounts of an otherworldly being. However, I'm hopeful that there is a rational scenario that exists that can explain how a random mix of light, fog, and mechanical mishaps caused so much chaos and uncertainty for me and my dog. I've had years to think about this, and unfortunately I'm just as stumped today as I was on that night. Although there have been other unexplained things that have happened to me in the time between, I have thankfully never seen anything like this again.